Welcome to the Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two-kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and friends of the program all around the country. I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to the Liberty Alert, where every week we try to cut through the noise and take on the issues, especially the public issues that matter to people of faith. Today, we have on our program Dr. Robert Benne, the Jordan Trexler Professor of Religion Emeritus and Research Associate in Religion and Philosophy, the department at Roanoke College, but he's also currently the Professor of Christian Ethics for the online Lutheran Institute of Theology. And many of you know him from our earlier time. We had him in our program. He wrote the book Paradoxical Vision that's foundational to a lot of the work that I do, reasonable ethics and good and bad ways to think about religion and politics. Now, today we have him on because he just wrote an op-ed. And let me get to the title of that particular op-ed. It's Diversity, Inclusivity, and Equity, the New Trinity, driven by two destructive ideologies. Well, that seems like a provocative title, Dr. Benne. So first of all, welcome. And how are things going after this op-ed?
Well, I expected I would get some blowback from that, and I did. I identify this as a new religion.
Okay.
It substitutes for a lot of confusion about what institutions are really for. So one way to kind of short circuit any further confusion is to adopt equity, inclusivity, and diversity.
Let me just say this, one of the things, and I've been involved in this stuff too. My PhD is in Black liberation theology, which, is a forerunner of critical race theory, and its challenge to a healthy diversity, a healthy inclusivity and equality, not equity. I guess that's been my biggest problem is that when they, the folks that we're arguing against, they understand the power of language. And so they specifically couch these discussions in bumper sticker language. Well, who would be against diversity? So, we're not against diversity. We're against their solution or their strategy for diversity. And again, even equity, the equity versus equality, you cannot have equity and have freedom. Because in order to have equity, you have to be able to take over everybody's choices and make sure they all come out the same at the end. Who would want to live in a culture like that? So my first question to you is, the narrative. Our people, I think, are getting overwhelmed by the fact that they think the narrative is diversity, you have to think this way, or else you're against it. When in reality, we're saying, no, there's a different way to get to that. And there's even a different understanding of what those words mean, right? How do we take this narrative back? Absolutely.
Well, in the op-ed piece, I try to start with the idea that for most people, diversity, inclusivity, and equity are kind of continuations of the old 60s emerging notion of affirmative action, which we've participated in 40 years. So it's very much like the Black Lives Matter thing. Who would be against Black Lives Matter?
Right.
But if you look at the organization and its ideology, it's extremely radical. Well, one wouldn't want to identify oneself at all with it. I mean, if you were a Christian or if you were a Democrat, believer in democracy and the nuclear family.
Right.
So the phrase inclusivity, diversity, and equity seems harmless enough as an extension of that affirmative action. Even affirmative action has its doubtful characteristics. There's a hard form of that and there's a soft form of that. A lot of discussion of way back in the 60s about the different kinds of affirmative action. I would be for a soft form of affirmative action, but certainly not the harder forms. And now this has taken a whole another meaning because beneath it, as I argue in the op-ed, are two very destructive ideologies, the one critical racial theory and the other one gender ideology.
Yeah, before you get to that, let me just say, you did a great job in this op-ed of describing this as a new religion.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of times people think, oh, this is science. No, this is a new religious affirmation. This is an assertion of truth that's really not coherent, and it's not really an extension of the reality that we know. So talk about how that is, and then get to those, like you said, those two destructive ideologies that both undergird and promote this.
Well, in the op-ed, I was careful not to attack persons or parties. I said that those ideologies are destructive of Christian anthropological assumptions that have been in the culture for many centuries, and that we depart from at our risk, at our hazard.
Explain that. I mean, so you're talking about the notion that human beings are both.
Racial theory divides people into the oppressed and the oppressor on the basis of skin characteristics.
Right.
I mean, it's bizarre and so coarse and crude. No one really believes that or acts that way, but that's the ideology that's used to whack people on the head. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Christian anthropological notion is that we're all created in the image of God and worthy of respect, regardless of our color. But secondly, we're all fallen and need repentance and grace. Those are the two indelible characteristics of humanity. And what the critical racial theory does is racialize it and make whites the inheritors of white privilege, whiteness, and all sorts of crazy things because you're a particular color. And then the blacks are hapless victims, which is many very perceptive narrators notice how diminishing that is of Black people.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I remember there's something on television where they were talking about voter ID, and they went to white liberals out in Berkeley and said, is this a good law? And they said, no, it targets Black people. And then they asked them why, and they said, well, they wouldn't know how, some might not know how to get an ID and some might not know how to do this. Then they went and talked to Black folks in New York, and they said, this is crazy. We know where the DMV is. We can go get our own IDs.
Well, and it makes Black destiny dependent upon white generosity. I mean, it's really crazy.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell argues against that for sure. And like you said, the Christian worldview, it has a healthy understanding of who we are as human beings created in the image of God, but then a healthy reality that we're fallen. And I think that's what the new secularism's against. It doesn't believe in the fallenness of humanity, which is why it's got to put all these things into structures and then wipe out structures and build what they call social equity structures. And again, we've seen this happen for the last 100 years. Socialism, Nazism, we've seen them build those structures. They're not good for us as human beings, right?
Right. And for Blacks being identified as pure victims, there's no room for being guilty.
Right.
And remember, way back in the 60s, the argument was Blacks could not be racist because they didn't have power.
Right.
It was only whites that had power, and therefore only whites could be racist. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense. And class would probably be a much better category to analyze things in rather than race. And I hope we finally get over this racialism, which has come back, and it's very dangerous, I think. And what we need to do is class analysis a lot better to talk about the plight of human beings.
Well, let me just, and before you get to the second one too, let me just say this, that in my work in the city, and I've always tried to be a city guy who empowers the neighborhood, this kind of stuff doesn't help Black people or white people. So, a lot of times you're probably of defending this because you're a white guy. But in reality, it doesn't help average Black people either.
And most Black people don't buy into it.
Right.
And at the ground level, Blacks and whites relate to each other as human beings, not in these categories. Right. So it's kind of an elite phenomenon that's been kind of pressed on the culture. And I don't think it'll have lasting impressions. I hope we get over it quickly. It's a disastrous thing. But the 60s racialism died out too.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that this will die out. The one thing that's more disturbing, I think, is the gender ideology.
Right.
That didn't die out with the 60s. The cultural revolution went on. The political revolution didn't, nor the economic revolution, but the cultural one did. Okay. That's been relentlessly pushing from the 60s onward. And I'm not sure there's an end point for the LGBTQI agenda. And that's the second thing I criticize. And that's, I think, has been more active in institutions than even the racial thing.
Right.
Now, the LGBTQ agenda, what I pointed out there is well, the more deeply theological issues is that it denies the polarity of the sexes, that, from the very beginning, God made them male and female, and cultures have affirmed that for centuries. I mean, it's nothing. There's not much argument about that. And here we're trying to reverse a tremendously deeply embedded theological and anthropological notion that there's a polarity between man and woman. And that is really taken force in this institution, why I'm in the library.
Right.
In my old office. By the way, I wanted to mention, after I wrote my editorial, I got a blowback from another op-ed claiming that the big problem with me was that I was a fearful white man.
Right, exactly.
That makes everybody laugh when I tell them that, because I don't seem to be terribly fearful.
And you're just such a nice guy, too. That's what.
By golly, though, that kind of blowback does deter a lot of people. A lot of conservatives are worried, and they don't speak out. And that's a little dangerous position to be in. Normal, ordinary people don't protest enough unless they're really provoked, like Loudoun County. And now this stuff with the Bale swimmer.
Right.
Boy, that's pushing the elite to push back. I mean, is there anything more elite than Penn and Harvard and swim teams? Well, anyway, I got this opposing editorial claiming that I was a fearful white man. But the other thing is our house got egged. We don't have any idea. We think it's probably college students of the LGBT various groups that read my editorial and were very upset about my critique of gender theory, which gender theory has this assumption of radical plasticity of the human being. Oddly enough, and I didn't point it out in the editorial, but you'll probably picked it up already, that the first one, the critical racial theory, has indelible characteristics that can't be changed of races.
Correct.
The other one, the gender ideology, has utmost radical plasticity.
Right. And Choi, you can choose to be one thing one day and choose to be another thing the other day. Absolutely. And both are true.
On the critical racial theory, you're stuck with your race. So, both ideologies, which are very, very active, are incoherent and contradictory. And even within the LGBTQ, there's a lot of contradiction between, for example, transgender and lesbians and gays. Boy, there's a big problem there. But anyway, those contradictions will probably come out and unravel things a little bit more.
Well, let me just say this, because for those of you listening to listen, if you're struggling with the lifestyle, or you're confused about these discussions, we're not saying don't have a conversation and that you shouldn't have to speak the truth in love and care about one another. We're saying that there's a group of people now that are weaponizing differences here. And what I mean by this is not just eggs on the house. I mean, there are places too where these are hate speech laws. The police are coming to get you if you say these things, which are basically traditional moral views of the Bible and of a lot of Christians and a lot of Americans. And we're very upset about the people who are weaponizing these things, the activists who are using force, coercion, fear tactics. That kind of stuff has to stop. And that kind of stuff is what you're seeing happen, isn't it, Dr. Benne?
Absolutely. And that's one way they achieve righteousness. There are hardly any ordinary or lower or working class people. They're kind of elite people that hopped on to these ideologies as a way to signal their virtue and to make them feel good and give them purpose. That's why I say it's a new religion giving them purpose, but it's finally incoherent. It doesn't have much substance to it, but for the moment, it gives them energy and targets that they can work at.
And usually those targets are, I don't mean to say that you're defenseless, because you're a thinker. You've got the words, the capability to defend yourself in print. But a lot of these folks just don't even want to hear what you have to say. And so they're going to make sure that you're not heard. And that's the kind of stuff, again, that we're saying, wait a minute, in a culture of freedom, in a culture of equality, in a culture that learns how to care for neighbor by dialoguing across the fence with people who are different than us, we can't have certain people shutting us down and making these conversations illegal. And that's what we're fighting against.
And it's going on all over in academia. People who aren't well known or powerful get fired for having the wrong opinions, even obliquely wrong opinions, but think what it's doing in terms of hiring.
Right.
Keep all these things out of your dossier. Years ago, someone from Roanoke College told me you can never put on a dossier that you're an evangelical. You just won't even be accepted as a candidate for an academic position. And now, if you're a classical Christian, you better be quiet, and you'll never get hired anyway because they'll ask you these questions.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why even at not at the university level, but especially in high school and grade school, that's one of the reasons we fight for educational choice, or what we call parental choice, because parents have the right and the responsibility to raise their kids in the ethos of education that they wish, and that's even being taken away at the lower levels. And I don't see any way of reforming that except to give people choice to go to other institutions that honor that. Now, so let's break down some of these things. Diversity, we're for diversity. In fact, the Bible talks about this all the time, but it's a diversity that is built on the characteristic of a common faith in Jesus Christ, or a common understanding of our created reality. Right. Their diversity is something that is supposedly on an outward manifestation and a political ideology. What's the difference there?
Well, one of my colleagues has written a long article that there isn't much attention at all to race in the Bible. Right. Yeah, I mean, there are tribes of people, right? But race doesn't figure in much at all, and usually it's pagan versus Christian in the Bible. But and of course.
And tribes are extended families. That's what people don't understand. We're the nuclear family that we argue for in America. It's not that we're saying nuclear only. We're saying a nuclear family that takes responsibility for the children, at that level, but it's always a part of an extended family. That's America.
Those things wax and wane, right?
Right. But again, to say, let's get rid of the family
is crucial.
Yeah.
And then you have times where it's only the nuclear family, but it can be the extended. We don't have any trouble with that,
Not at all.
Can take various forms, but the triad of mom and dad and child is much more crucial, it seems to me.
Yeah.
That's biblical and traditionally Christian. So the other forms of the family that extend it one way or another are flexible in history from a Christian point of view, but that triad is pretty crucial.
Yeah, I call that the Trinity of civility. The Trinity of civility. You cannot have in fact, we argued this when the defund the police movement came out. We said, that defund the police and the family are in an inverse relationship. So if you have less police, you need stronger families. If you have weak families or no fathers, you probably need some kind of force, to keep what I call the 15 to 19-year-old boys high on testosterone kind of in their place. Because all of us would do stupid things at that age as young boys. And again, you can't destroy the family and destroy the police and have a community that's safe and prosperous. And so again, we had no problem getting involved in this. You want less police? That's great. Then have stronger families.
Right. Well, they kind of be sobering up on this defund the police thing.
But they're still not incentivizing the family, though. Well, talk a little bit about the other one, the equity, because that's the one I think that's very easy to debunk. Equity versus equality.
Well, I would say equality of opportunity.
Right.
That's the American tradition, and it seems to me extremely important to uphold that as open for all comers.
Yeah, and affirmative action was to get everybody to the same starting line, I thought.
Well, yeah, although it's tried to fix the finishing line a little bit too, affirmative action.
Right.
And the soft version was if they're all equal, roughly equal in terms of capacities and talents, then you opt for the minority if they're roughly equal. And a hard version of affirmative action was based upon their racial characteristics or the sexual characteristics. That's very close to what we're at now in terms of the current notions of diversity and inclusiveness. I want to make one point about those two things that is very tricky. Okay. It's not accepting and being tolerant of different kinds of people, even the LGBTQ as well as racial different kinds of ethnic, not just being tolerant, but inclusivity and diversity means they come in with their agendas and their ideologies, and you cannot criticize that.
Right.
That's part of the current one, which dampens any kind of discussion any kind of critique from a classical Christian point of view or any kind of point of view. You simply, for example, the transgender ideology that suggests that people can choose their sex or their gender. Gender is the new name. I try to keep using the language of sex. You can dominate your body by what you think internally. That has to be accepted.
Well, and again, we got to, as Christians, the biblical notions of the moral truths of the Bible, which are differentiated ultimately from the proclamation of salvation, insofar as the moral truths don't save us, but they are true, and they actually prevent us becoming even worse than what we are. So God engages us through his law and through his gospel, ultimately to save. But folks, those things are true for everybody. Those moral truths are true for everybody. And again, even the founding fathers understood that good law in our culture had to reflect the Ten Commandments in some form or fashion. And if they actually violated them, there's no good that could come of that. And so if you care about people, the notion that they're XX or XY and they're created and redeemed by God is a great message to try to get across to them, because God loves them. And to say that my gender is fluid and it's my choice and there is no God and I'm on my own, there's going to have personal, moral, ethical consequences to that we don't want to see in people's lives. And I think sometimes we lose the fact we're not just fighting to protect our voice. We really care about people who differ with us, and that's why we want to have this dialogue.
And we care about the social goods, the good of society. Think of what we're experiencing now because of the sexual revolution, the low marriage rate, the dropping fertility rate, young children being confused about their sexual identity. I mean, I never thought once as a child whether I was a boy or a girl. Yeah. And now kids are introduced to kind of uncertainties like this. And that uncertainty, if it persists, I mean, that's going to lead to less marriage, fewer children, and a lot more chaos in terms of family life. So there are huge social effects of this sexual revolution, and there will be huge social effects if this racial ideology continues.
Yeah, and again, even when you talked about that, they're introducing these ideas to children at a time when they have literally no capacity to deal with it. They don't have their minds, their brains aren't fully formed yet. They're puberty and all that makes such a huge difference in how people finally root themselves. Their family structure is so key to all this, and they're introducing these things in grade school to start confusing children, and that just can't be a good thing for individual children.
Well, and the media are all over this kind of stuff. It first was portraying gays, but now it's portraying all different sexual minorities. Did you see the graph of the current generation? I forget even what the current generation is called. Something like 20% identify with the LGBTQ scale. Again,
like you said, the power of suggestion, the power of cultural pressure, peer pressure, and then sexual confusion. When you start to, when you're confused about intimacy, the Bible talks about intimacy this way: leave, cleave, and there's intimacy. And so intimacy comes after the leaving, after the cleaving, which is commitment, marriage, all that stuff. Because now you can actually trust somebody with your inner thoughts and insecurities and sexual insecurities and stuff like that. Well, they put intimacy at the very beginning. Now it's like, if you don't have sex after the first date, what kind of relationship is this? And it's confusing. And then you add to that sexual confusion, gender confusion. Wow. How are kids even supposed to come out of this stuff healthy? Well, what are some things we can do? I mean, some solutions. How do we take this stuff on?
I really think that at the ground level, there's a lot of normality, and people are not quite aware of the power of these ideologies at the elite level.
Okay.
So I think when the ordinary people get pressed, they're gonna rebel. They're gonna push back. Now the elite are pushing back, like we've already talked about in Loudoun County, and at the elite level of the Penn State swimming team.
Right.
But I think ordinary people aren't quite aware. As I said, they take this new religion as a surface thing, not as the deeper thing that is really undermining, can undermine our lives together. But I think there's a lot of health yet at the ground level, right, and that we have to be politically and socially alert and make arguments. We can't self-censor. I'm told that, a lot of parts of the United States, you'd never hear this stuff in the schools. Here in Salem, which is a conservative kind of city. I keep asking my grandsons who are at the high school where this stuff is pushed at them. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the year, they said, well, one teacher wanted to do the pronoun thing. And after a couple of weeks or after a week, that pressure stopped. Because what was happening is parents were saying, whoa, we don't want you to do that. We don't want the critical racial theory. And so the faculties, if they have these more avant-garde opinions, don't push it. So I think there are currents of normality in the society that are going to push back. And politically, I think we're going to see a reversal, not a reversal, but certainly a pushback on this. And so much depends upon the resuscitation of the Judeo-Christian tradition,
right?
Its anthropology, its notion of family life, its notion of marriage and sexual ethics is so dependent upon that. I hope there's a renewal of the churches, but I don't know how it's going to happen, except from the Lord's Spirit visiting us again. What do you think?
Well, I think we have to definitely fight for religious liberty so we can keep our voice alive in culture, like you said. But then we have to learn to speak the truth in love in such a way that we engage these things. Like I said, when I talk about racialism, I always talk about Darwin. I always say, if you're a Darwinist, you have to be a racist. And the secularists were the racist of the last 100 years. They formed these ideological things. And we've been fighting the Enlightenment racism and the Enlightenment secularity for a long time in this culture. But for some reason, Christianity gets blamed for the Enlightenment's abuses. And I think we've got to fight that back.
It's quite disappointing or disconcerting that we're becoming more and more of a post-Christian society. The effects of that are going to be disastrous. I think we still have a fighting chance. America's been has had a history of revival and renewal, and I don't think it's impossible that it could happen again when people will come to their senses. But right now, it looks pretty grim because the churches are dwindling, and every grandparent I know worries about their grandchildren.
Right. Well, one of the books that I used to always read early, especially in my ministry, was a book by D. James Kennedy, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? And it talks about the influence of the Christian worldview, the biblical worldview. If Christ had never been born, the world that we live in would be a much different place. For example, the golden rule was turned from, it used to be don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Well, Jesus turned that around and said, do to others what you want them to do to you. And just the positive force of life, the positive force of marriage. So I think the Christian worldview, we have to demonstrate that even though, this is stuff that doesn't save us, but it's produced such tolerance, it's produced such freedom, it's produced such opportunity for all people. We have to actually get back to defending that as we also proclaim the good news of Jesus. And I hope we can talk to you more about it in the future.
Delight to do it.
Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.